Good evening. It's a few minutes after 7, and we're in the midst of introducing our 11-week topic. And the topic is how the nature of man hinders or aids being conformed to the image of Christ. Now, that's a mouthful in itself, but I probably should tell you how this whole series or study came about. It was back in November of 2021, typical weekday night, went to bed at 9, and from the time I hit the bed, I started having these thoughts, insights, and visions about topics that I have been thinking about for a number of months. One of those being the nature of man, that is basically soul and spirit and how that relates and so forth. And the other simply being, what does it mean to be conformed to the image of Christ? And so I thought, after an hour or two of these, I call them downloaded visions and insights from the Lord, I wasn't getting any sleepier. And as it turned out, I went an entire night from 9 p.m. to the time I finally decided to get up at 5 in the morning, all night long, having these bubbles of insights and visions concerning these various aspects of man, the nature of man, and being conformed to the image of Christ. So when I finally got up the next morning, I started writing, making some notes together on that. And that's how this series ultimately came about. I saw that there was connection between all these pieces that I was hearing or receiving from the Lord. And so I was able to take those pieces and organize them in what I felt was a coherent way. And as a result of that, I struggle with how to represent what this series of insights represents. And I finally came up with this mouthful topic that I just gave to you: how the nature of man either hinders or aids being conformed to the image of Christ. Now, the overall description is pretty straightforward. You see, the nature of man, which is, of course, a three-part being, body, soul, and spirit, has been corrupted by the fall. The pure nature of man that existed originally leaned into being conformed to the image of Christ. But after the fall, that nature assimilated the knowledge of evil as well as good. And so now where we are after the fall is that the three aspects of man's nature now lean into the corrupted knowledge of evil and good. And that impacts the body, soul, and spirit, and it hinders conformity to Christ. And so our goal as believers and serious Christians is to reject the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and allow the Spirit to empower that spirit of life in Christ to conform us to Him. Now, I want to use an analogy on how we're going to approach this whole topic. And the analogy that I got is considering a disease. Man has hundreds, if not thousands, of diseases that he struggles with ever since the fall. But let's just take one, and I want to show you how we want to use this analogy for disease. Let's take, for example, heart disease. Now, there's, again, different kinds of heart disease, but let's just take a simple heart attack. Okay, that's a disease. Now, what are the hindrances, if you will, or symptoms that represent that type of disease? Well, there's high blood pressure, high cholesterol, there's stress, and there's probably other hindrances as well. So, being aware of that, what would be the aids, if you will, or antidotes to those hindrances that cause heart attacks? Well, how about this? There's medicine for high blood pressure. That would be an aid or an antidote to one of those hindrances. There's medicine for cholesterol. That's an aid for another one of those hindrances. Um, how about this? There's tranquil heart and peace, which is an aid for the other hindrance, which is stress. And so you can look at a disease in terms of the symptoms that you have to deal with because of the disease, and then aids that you can apply to those symptoms in order to relieve or to cure the disease. Now, that's the analogy I want to use with this series. The disease of the fall is sin. The symptom of the disease we will refer to as a hindrance. And the antidote, if you will, or cure of the disease symptom, we will refer to as an aid. Okay? So, with that in mind, we're going to look at every aspect of the three-part nature of man: the body, the soul, that is, the intellect, the will, the emotions, and finally the spirit. And we're going to look at each one of those aspects of man in terms of what are the hindrances that that aspect of man deals with because of the fall. And then we're going to look at what are the aid or aids or cures or antidotes, whatever word you'd like to use, that can help overcome and destroy those hindrances to that sin or that symptom of sin. And of course, along the way, the idea is to be more and more conformed to the image of Christ. So, starting tonight, we're going to look at 11 related topics along this line. The first tonight we're going to address is the nature of man in the image of God. We're going to look at the body, soul, and spirit in terms of its faculties so we can get a clear idea of what each of those parts of a man ourselves is. And next time, we're going to look at what it means to be conformed to the image of Christ. So, with those two foundation topics, then we'll be prepared to move forward and look at the body and the soul and the spirit and the respective aids and hindrances of them. Okay? So, as we progress, we will look closely at each aspect of the nature of man, and we will examine how closely in our own selves it is already conformed to the image of Christ or not. And so that's what we're going to be doing for the next 11 weeks. So are you ready? All right, let's get going. So tonight, study one. And if you don't have notes, by the way, if you're listening to this later, I need your email so that I can keep up with you and send you email attachment weekly with the notes so that if you're remote, you'll have the material that you can also follow along with. So text me at 281-300-5065 and put your name, and your email address in that text, and I'll make sure that you will have the weekly notes and updates. Okay, that's 281 300 5065. Okay, study one, the nature of man in the image of God. First, as a foundation, we must understand the nature of man. And most of us have a fair idea of what our nature is, but we get a little fuzzy sometimes trying to pin down this or that aspect of man's nature. Well, let's look first of all at Genesis. God says in chapter 1, verse 26, let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over every crawling thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So let's think about the nature of man with respect to the nature of God. God, and I know we don't normally think of him in this respect, but if you think about it, it's true. First of all, how many persons are there in the Trinity, in the God that we know? Well, there's three. There's Father, there's Son, there's Holy Spirit. Okay? Well, what does the Bible said and show us about each one of those persons of the Godhead? Well, first of all, God the Father, he is spirit, right? I mean, John says he is spirit. How about the Holy Spirit? Well, he also is pure spirit. Now we come to the Son. What aspects does the Son of God represent in eternity? Well, the Son, we know, has a body, Emmanuel. He also has a soul, and he also has a spirit. Okay? So we might say this: in the Godhead are all three aspects of both God and man: body, soul, and spirit. We could also say this: in man are all three aspects of both man and God: body, soul, and spirit. Now, if I ask you, for example, to define body very simply, what would you say as a definition? Well, the body is what I can feel. The body is what I can touch and interact with. Okay? How about the soul? How would you define the soul? Well, we typically understand from the Bible that the soul has three aspects in and of itself, right? It has mind, will, and emotions, or we could say intellect, will, and emotions. Okay? So, if I ask you to define spirit, what might you say? Well, it's how I'm alive, spirit. Okay? See, all those are okay, but they're not going to be sufficient to understand in some more precise context what is the body, what is the soul, and what is the spirit, so that we can look in depth at the hindrances of each of those areas and the aids to overcoming those hindrances. So let me propose to you a definition that the Lord showed me many years ago, and it helped crystallize a lot of fuzzy understanding that I had about these aspects of our lives. Consider that each of these aspects, body, soul, and spirit of man, can be defined, and I'm saying defined, a definition, can be defined by its faculties of communication that are bestowed on it. Okay, what do I mean by that? So let's take the body, for example. The body can be defined by the faculties of the five senses, right? Sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. And those faculties communicate with the entire environment that we find ourselves immersed in. Okay, hold that thought. Let's look at the soul. The soul can be defined by the faculties of communication of intellect and will and emotions, which enable us to communicate with other men. Okay, hold that thought. The spirit can be defined as by the faculties of faith and hope and love that enables us to communicate directly with God. So the body, that is the part of man that communicates with its environment, is through the faculties of sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste. The soul is that part of man that communicates with other men through the faculties of intellect, will, and emotions. And the spirit is that part of man that communicates directly with God through the faculties of faith, hope, and love. Now, if you'll hold on to those, I know there's probably a lot of questions. We're going to delve into a lot more detail here in a few moments. But with just that 50,000-foot view of what the body, soul, and spirit consist of, let's consider this: the influence of fallen man after the sin versus the redeemed man. You see, every aspect of fallen man now has sinful imperatives. The body has them, the soul has them, the spirit has them. The disease of the fall of man is sin. The symptom of the disease are manifested in the body, in the soul, and in the spirit. And those symptoms we'll refer to as hindrances. The antidote to cure, if you will, or destroy each of those symptoms or hindrances is the fruit of the spirit, and we'll refer to that as AIDS. Okay? Now, the bottom line is, until each aspect of our nature is conformed to the image of Christ, we are not yet mature in this age. And furthermore, the body, our physical body today, will not be mature or perfect in this age at all until the resurrection. And that's where that happens. So for now, in this life, that leaves the soul and the spirit of man to be perfect or matured into the image of Christ in this age to the extent that His grace empowers us. However, we should realize that even the body plays a role in our earthly perfecting by its influence on the soul and on the spirit. Okay? So in this series, we're going to look at the specific symptoms of the disease of sin in the body, in the soul, and in the spirit. And then we will look at the antidote, if you will, or the aid of the fruit of the Spirit in destroying, if you will, or curing the symptoms in the body, in the soul, and in the spirit. And that is the end of the lesson in terms of its focus. Now I want to go back to what we introduced a little earlier in terms of the three aspects of a man being defined by its faculties of communication. And I want to go in more detail because I think that'll help us as we go along. So, the nature of man. We know that man is comprised of body, soul, and spirit. And yes, it's easy enough to recognize and define what constitutes the body, but it gets a little more fuzzy to distinguish and recognize the soul and the spirit. And just to introduce quickly a couple of Hebrew terms, and we're not going to go into word studies. The Hebrew and Greek terms for soul, lebab, L-E-B-A-B, means the inner man, understanding, thinking, passion, and emotions. The Hebrew and Greek word for spirit, nephesh, represents the very breath of life, the living being. But however, instead of trying to define and understand our three-part nature directly, there's another way of understanding these. Think of these three aspects of man by virtue of how each communicates. So the body, what? The body has the five senses, and the body is that part of man, this is the definition of body, that communicates with his environment through the faculties of sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. The soul, the definition of soul that we'll be using, the soul is that part of man which communicates to men through the faculties of intellect, will, and emotions. And the spirit, the definition of spirit we will use is that the spirit is that part of man that communicates with God through the faculties of faith, hope, and love. So let's take a deeper look at each one of these to try to get a better appreciation. First of all, the body, the faculties. We have five senses, and some unfortunate people only have less than five. But can you imagine not having any senses at all? No sight, smell, hearing, taste, touch at all. The environment, first of all, would be unable to communicate to my body through any of those senses because they don't exist. So my body would have no experience of any physical world. It would be analogous to the movie where a disembodied brain sits in a jar, unable to perceive anything, right? You've seen the movies. Now, on the other hand, my body would also be unable to communicate with the environment. In effect, the physical world would not be aware of my physical body without those sensory interactions. I wouldn't be touching it, seeing, hearing, smelling, or tasting it. Okay? So, that's body. Hold on to that thought. And let's get into a little bit more difficult area, the soul. every communication, remember, the soul is that part of man that communicates through the faculties of intellect, will, and emotions with other men. Okay, that's what the soul is. So every communication now that we have with another man, another person, is in essence an impartation of one of these areas, either our intellect, that is knowledge, understanding, our will, or our emotions. So let's look at each of that. If we want to communicate to another person some aspect of our intellect, we can do something like this. 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. Or it's raining outside, so I would get wet if I went out now. Okay? So it's very simple impartation of knowledge or understanding that the intellect of that person has communicated to another. So every communication that uses the faculty of intellect contains either knowledge, facts, or understanding that resides in the person. Let's look at will for a moment. We're still in the soul. Okay. The will of man is communicated through directives that are to be obeyed. Let's get a couple of simple examples here. Joe, Susie, go over to the table and bring me a glass of water. Billy, don't go to the game tonight. Hey, y'all, vote for Joe Smith. Okay. So every communication that uses the faculty of the will of man expresses a desire or decision to be fulfilled or not. Okay. Let's look at the emotions, still in the soul. The emotions obviously are the passions that we all experience day in, day out. How about a couple of these simple examples? You don't love me anymore. And you can say that in a tone of sadness or anger or disappointment or other aspects. Okay. Here's another emotion. He's an idiot for doing that. Said in a tone of what? Surprise, anger, judgment. Okay. Here's another one. I just love that apple pie. Said in a tone of joy or excitement. Okay. Every communication that uses the faculty of emotions expresses any of the emotions that man might experience. Happiness, sadness, anger, hatred, joy, ... We've got a lot of emotions, don't we? So in summary now, the soul of man communicates with other men through the expressions of his intellect, his will, and his emotions. And frequently, these communications have elements of all three of these simultaneously. Simple example, parent to teen kid says, Billy, I just looked, it's snowing outside. So the visibility for driving will be very limited. I don't want you going out tonight because I'm afraid you could have an accident and be hurt or killed. Can you see the faculties there? The intellect, it's snowing. Visibility is poor. Will, I don't want you going out driving. Emotions, I am afraid. You see that? So man to man, we typically will communicate out of our soul very frequently, if not continuously. Okay? Let's look at the spirit for a moment. We said earlier, the spirit of man is that which can actually communicate with God directly. You know, there's a lot of scriptures here that support all this, but the one that pops into my mind right away is God is spirit, and they must worship him in spirit and in truth. Okay? So man and God communicate via the faculties of the spirit, which are faith, hope, and love. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. And remember, God is love. And may the God of hope fill you, and so forth. And many scriptures around faith, hope, and love make it clear that our faculties for communication to and from God reside in the spirit of man. So, for man to communicate to God, our communication is via some expression of faith or hope or love. For example, a man says, praying to God, Father, I believe you care for me. You're with me now. That's faith. Or he may express hope and communicate that to the Lord. Father, you will bring me to my eternal home with you. That is my hope. How about love? Father, I want to please you so that I will subject my desires to your desire for me. Okay? So here's the key. Any prayer, petition, plea, or communication from God to man contains elements of faith toward God, or hope in God, and our love toward God. If there's not the tiniest smidgen of faith, hope, or love present, there's no communication with God. Period. Even an agnostic or atheist, note this, even an agnostic or atheist can direct a communication to God that has some tiny smidgen of faith or hope or love, and thus be heard and saved by God's mercy and grace. Okay? Now, let's look at the flip side. God's communication to man through our faculties. He's communicating typically faith and hope and love. For example, God says, communicating faith to us, God gives us peace and assurance in our spirit, our heart, that he knows us and he is with us. That's faith, okay? We probably read that in one of umpteen number of scriptures throughout the Old and New Testament. How about hope? God can communicate hope to us. How? Well, one way is he places a dream or a desire or a vision in you, maybe for a vocation or for a task, and certainly for eternal life. That is hope, okay, from God to you. How about love? God imparts to you a knowing that he unconditionally loves you, even though you are truly not worthy. Okay? So, in summary, the spirit of man is that which communicates to God with the faculties of faith, hope, and love. And God communicates with man's spirit via imparting faith and hope and love. You know the scriptures that say, now abides these three things. What are they? Faith, hope, and love. And of course, the greatest being love. So these faculties that reside in the spirit of man are what connects us to God. Now, having said all that, I have to add a final disclaimer here. And it's with respect to the Lord and his communication skills. I said, even though God is spirit, since he is omni everything, he's omnipresent, omni-knowing, everything that we can understand, God is omni, that is infinitely capacity in those areas. So he totally encompasses all creation, and that includes the three-part aspect of man: body, soul, and spirit. So, and here's the key: God is entirely able and can communicate with all aspects of man, not just the spirit. He can use the sensory faculties to communicate. Uh, how about examples? The burning bush, miracles, voices, and fill in all those other examples. Or he can use the intellect and will and emotions and communicate. Witness the innumerable instances in the Old and New Testament where he communicates directly to the soul of man, the intellect, the will, the emotions, sometimes all in a communication, okay? As well as God can certainly use the faculties of the Spirit, which are faith, hope, and love, to communicate with man. So here's the bottom line in this matter. God can communicate to man via all the faculties in his body, in his soul, in his spirit. Man can communicate to God only through the Spirit via its faculties of faith, hope, and love. Okay? So this may be a lot to chew on, but hopefully there's a few days between now and next week at this time. And if you do listen to this and you do want these notes and you want to pick up and follow on, send me a text, 281-300-5065 with your name and your email address, and we will keep you up to date with that. And with that, I'm going to sign off, and we will see you next week. Thank you.